Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The first thing that hit Dr. Nolan Ryker when he emerged from 3 years of cryo-sleep wasn't the familiar copper taste of preservation fluid or the bone-deep ache of muscles unused for so long. It was the sound of his own voice whispering to him from somewhere inside the walls of the Argyros, but speaking words he'd never said. "Don't go deeper," his voice said, barely audible above the ship's mechanical hum. "Turn back now while you still remember who you are. I've already been where you're going, and I'm still there." The impossible words sent ice through his veins. The voice wasn't just his, it carried the exact inflection he used when truly terrified, the slight tremor that appeared only when he faced something beyond his ability to survive. Nolan sat bolt upright in his cryopod, his 42-year-old heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The voice faded into silence, leaving only the steady rhythm of the ship's life support systems and the distant hum of engines that had carried them across impossible distances while they slept. Around him, the other 7 crew members were stirring in their respective pods, showing no sign that they had heard anything unusual. Nolan pressed his ear to the cold metal wall, listening for any trace of the impossible whisper, but heard nothing except the normal sounds of a vessel in deep space, the subtle groaning of metal under pressure, the whisper of recycled air through ventilation systems, the barely perceptible vibration of the fusion reactor that kept them alive in the cosmic void. Captain Elena Torres was already at the main console, her weathered fingers dancing across the displays with the practiced efficiency of someone who had commanded vessels through asteroid fields and solar storms for nearly 3 decades. Her grey hair was pulled back in the regulation knot she'd worn since her academy days, and her dark eyes held the steady focus that had made her legendary among deep space explorers. "Morning, everyone," she said, though morning and evening were meaningless concepts in the depths of interstellar space, where the only light came from distant stars that might have died millennia ago. "Welcome back to the land of the living. Hope you all had pleasant dreams." Dreams? Nolan tried to remember what he had dreamed during the long sleep, but found only fragments that slipped away like water through his fingers. Images of silver liquid that moved with its own intelligence, faces that might have been his own calling to him from depths that had no bottom, and a persistent sensation of drowning in something that wasn't quite water, but wasn't quite air either. The taste in his mouth was wrong too. Not just the expected metallic tang of preservation chemicals, but something organic and alive, like pond water that had been sitting in sunlight until it grew thick with algae and microscopic life. He'd tasted that same flavour once before, 27 years ago when he'd fallen through the ice on Miller's Pond during a childhood winter that had been particularly harsh. He'd been 12 years old, testing the ice despite his mother's warnings, when the frozen surface had given way beneath his feet. The dark water had rushed in around him, filling his mouth and nose with a taste that was part mud, part vegetation, and part something else, something that had seemed almost alive. For terrifying minutes that felt like hours, he'd been trapped beneath the frozen surface, clawing at ice that wouldn't break while darkness closed in around him, and water filled his lungs. His father had pulled him out eventually, but the experience had left him with a profound fear of deep water and enclosed spaces. More importantly, it had taught him to recognize when something fundamental was wrong with his environment, when the normal rules that govern safety and survival had been suspended Engineer David Phillips groaned as he stretched his tall, lanky frame, joints popping like gunshots in the quiet recovery bay. At 38, he was the youngest department head aboard the Argyros, but his reputation for keeping vessels operational under impossible conditions had earned him a place on humanity's most ambitious deep space exploration mission. "I dreamed I was drowning," he said with a nervous laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Funny thing is, I've never been afraid of water. Been swimming since I was 5 years old, used to compete in college." Communications Officer James Wright, barely 25 and fresh from the academy, nodded with the kind of troubled expression that suggested his own sleep hadn't been peaceful. "I had the same dream," he added, his young face creased with confusion. "But the water wasn't water. It was something else entirely. Something that wanted me to breathe it, like it was trying to replace the air in my lungs." Dr. Amanda Hayes moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had spent 15 years handling artifacts that could crumble at the slightest touch. Her specialty was xenoarchaeology, the study of extinct alien civilizations, and she'd joined this mission hoping to find evidence that intelligence had evolved elsewhere in the universe. "Dreams of drowning are common during extended cryo-sleep," she said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. "The brain sometimes interprets the preservation fluid in the lungs as a drowning sensation, creating vivid dreams of submersion." But Medical Officer Dr. Hassan al-Rashid was frowning at his diagnostic readouts, his dark eyes reflecting the concern of someone who had spent years learning to read the subtle signs of medical anomalies. "That's highly unusual," he said, his accented English carrying the precision of someone who had learned the language as an adult. "I'm showing elevated neurological activity in all of you during the sleep period, specifically in regions associated with aquatic adaptation and pressure tolerance." Navigation specialist Lisa Chen looked up from her star charts, her expression troubled. "What does that mean exactly?" Al-Rashid adjusted his displays, showing brain scan readouts that painted strange patterns across the screens. "It's almost as if your nervous systems were being prepared for existence in a high-pressure liquid environment. The neural pathways associated with underwater survival were being strengthened and enhanced while you slept." Security Chief Maria Santos felt her hand drift unconsciously toward the plasma rifle secured at her hip. At 41, she'd seen enough combat situations to recognize when something was fundamentally wrong with a scenario. "Are you saying something was modifying our brain chemistry while we were in cryo-sleep?" "I'm saying the patterns are consistent with external neural stimulation designed to adapt human physiology for aquatic environments," Al-Rashid replied carefully, "but that should be impossible given our ship's isolation and the sealed nature of the cryo-sleep systems." Nolan felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced as a 12-year-old boy when the ice had given way beneath his feet. Every survival instinct he'd developed over 20 years in hostile terrain was screaming at him that they were in immediate danger. "Status report, Arya," Captain Torres called out to the ship's artificial intelligence, her voice carrying the authority earned through 3 decades of command. "All crew members successfully revived, Captain," came the smooth, synthesized voice that had been their only companion during the long journey through the void. But there was something different about Arya's tone, a harmonic quality that seemed to resonate in their bones rather than their ears. "However, I must report a significant anomaly in our current position and trajectory." Torres's expression hardened into the mask of professional competence she'd worn through countless crises. In her experience, surprises in deep space were rarely pleasant ones, and often fatal to crews who weren't prepared for them. "Explain the nature of this anomaly in detail," she ordered. "We are currently approaching coordinates that were not part of our original mission parameters. Our present position indicates we have traveled approximately 4,732 light-years beyond our planned route. placing us at what theoretical models designate as the edge of observable space. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chen was already pulling up star charts, her fingers flying across her console with increasing urgency as she tried to reconcile their position with any known stellar formations. "That's impossible," she said, voice tight with disbelief and growing panic. "The navigation system has multiple redundant safeguards. Any significant course deviation should have triggered automatic revival sequences long before we reach this point." Nolan studied the stellar formations on his personal display, his trained eye immediately catching discrepancies that made his stomach clench with dread. As the ship's primary navigator and terrain analyst, he knew these star patterns the way a pilot knows familiar landmarks. The readings showed they had indeed travelled far beyond any territory marked on their most detailed charts into regions that existed only in theoretical models. "Nobody programmed this course," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of certainty earned through years of reading dangerous terrain. "Something else guided us here. Something that understood our technology well enough to circumvent every safety protocol we have without triggering a single alarm." Chen's face had gone pale as she cross-referenced the navigation data with every database at her disposal. The course corrections are incredibly subtle but perfectly coordinated across multiple systems. Whatever intelligence orchestrated this had intimate knowledge of our propulsion systems, our navigation algorithms, even our fuel consumption patterns, and crew scheduling. Phillips was running diagnostics on the ship's primary systems, his engineer's mind trying to find some rational explanation for their situation. The modifications to our flight path would have required access to our most secure systems. We're talking about changes that were implemented over the course of months, maybe years, with precision that suggests whoever did this understands our technology better than we do. "Arya," Torres said, her voice carrying the weight of command authority mixed with growing unease. "Run a complete diagnostic on all navigation, guidance, and monitoring systems. I want to know not just how we got here, but why our automate systems didn't detect the deviation until now." "Diagnostic complete, Captain. All systems are functioning within normal parameters. Navigation logs show a standard progression of our original mission trajectory with no recorded deviations, anomalies, or external interference of any kind." The impossibility of their situation settled over the crew like a burial shroud. Santos stepped forward, her military training making her automatically assess potential threats and defensive positions. "Captain, this has all the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated trap. Whatever brought us here didn't do it for our benefit, and it had intimate knowledge of our capabilities and procedures." "Agreed. Implement enhanced security protocols immediately. Full sensor sweeps every 5 minutes. Weapon systems on continuous standby, and nobody goes anywhere alone under any circumstances." But even as Torres gave the orders, Nolan noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection of the main viewport, he could see the crew moving around the bridge, but there were 9 figures in the reflection instead of 8. The additional figure stood directly behind him, wearing his face but with eyes that held depths no human gaze should possess. When he spun around to look, there was nothing there but empty air and the concerned faces of his crewmates. "Did anyone else see—" he began, but Wright's urgent voice cut him off. "Captain, you need to look at this immediately," the communications officer said, his face pressed against the observation deck windows. "The stars are disappearing." What they witnessed through the viewport defied every principle of stellar astronomy they'd ever studied. A blackened substance was spreading across the void ahead of them, moving like oil spilled across still water. But this wasn't simple obstruction or cosmic dust. The darkness seemed to consume light itself, erasing entire constellations from existence with methodical precision. Chen ran emergency calculations, her hands shaking as she tried to understand what they were observing. "This violates everything we know about physics and cosmology." Whatever that substance is, it's moving faster than light should be able to travel, but it's not creating any of the space-time distortions we'd expect from faster-than-light phenomena. Phillips monitored his instruments with growing alarm, checking and rechecking readings that seemed to defy rational explanation. All our systems are still functional, but external sensors are returning null values across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. No cosmic radiation, no stellar wind, no background microwave radiation. It's like space itself is being systematically emptied of everything that makes it space. Hayes leaned forward in her chair, her archaeological training making her think in terms of vast timescales and the rise and fall of civilizations across cosmic history. What if this isn't a natural phenomenon? What if some intelligence created this void deliberately, for purposes we can't begin to comprehend? The blackened sheen continued to expand with mechanical precision, erasing stellar formations that had burned for billions of years. The bright star Deneb, whose light had travelled over 2,600 years to reach their position, simply ceased to exist in their field of vision. Then, Vega vanished, followed by Altair, each stellar extinction as sudden and final as a candle being snuffed out by an invisible hand. Wright was monitoring communication frequencies, searching for any signal that might explain what they were witnessing. "I'm detecting something," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "Not radio signals, but some kind of modulated electromagnetic pattern. It's almost like music, but designed for neural tissue rather than auditory reception." Before anyone could respond to his observation, a sound began echoing through the ship's hull. It started as a barely perceptible vibration, like the creaking of old wood under stress, but as they listened, it resolved into something far more unsettling. A sound like footsteps walking on thin ice, magnified and distorted until it seemed to come from the ship's very structure. The crew froze, listening to the impossible noise that seemed to emanate from the Argyros itself. Wright moved to check the structural integrity sensors, but they showed no signs of stress, damage, or temperature fluctuation that could account for the sounds. "What was that?" Chen whispered, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to lower her voice. The sound came again, louder this time, and more complex, but now it was accompanied by something that made Nolan's blood turn to ice in his veins. The faint sound of voices, speaking in perfect unison from somewhere deep within the ship's hull. "We've been waiting for you," the voices said, though no communication system was active. The words seemed to come from the metal itself, vibrating through the ship's structure and into their bones. "We've been calling you home for so very long." Santos drew her weapon, though she wasn't sure what she intended to target. "This is wrong. Everything about this situation is fundamentally wrong. We need to reverse course immediately and get back to known space before whatever's doing this decides we've served our purpose." But when she looked at her crewmates, she saw something that made her hand tighten on her weapon. Their eyes had changed, not dramatically. The difference was so subtle that she might have missed it, if she hadn't been trained to notice small details that could mean the difference between life and death. But there was a depth to their gazes that hadn't been there before, as if they were looking at her from the bottom of a very deep well. Phillips ran emergency diagnostics on every system he could access, but everything registered as perfectly normal. "Could be some kind of acoustic phenomenon," he suggested, though his voice carried no conviction. Sound can behave strangely in the vacuum of space when it's transmitted through solid materials under specific conditions. But Nolan knew that wasn't what they were hearing. His survival instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle signs that preceded avalanches, flash floods and predator attacks, told him that something was not just aware of their presence, but had been orchestrating their arrival for centuries. The voices came again, but this time Nolan heard something that made his blood freeze. Mixed in with the alien harmonics were fragments of conversations from Earth. His mother calling his name during that winter when he'd fallen through the ice. His father's voice reading bedtime stories, his own voice from the academy graduation, where he'd sworn to push the boundaries of human knowledge. The cathedral wasn't just speaking to them. It was speaking with their own memories, using their most intimate experiences as a language they couldn't help but understand. Al-Rashid was monitoring the crew's biological functions with growing alarm. "I'm detecting unusual neurochemical changes in all of you. Elevated levels of compounds associated with deep sea diving adaptations, even though we're in a perfectly normal atmospheric environment." Phillips had started referring to their destination as the Moor during the crew briefing that followed, and the name spread through the ship with the inexorable gravity of absolute truth. It perfectly captured the sensation of being swallowed, of moving down a throat towards something vast and patient and eternally hungry. "It's like we're being digested," Wright said during their first meal after revival, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth as he stared at food that suddenly looked unappetizing. "Like we're already inside something's stomach, and it's just taking its time to break us down properly." Hayes looked up from her archaeological notes, which she'd been updating with observations about their situation. "I've been researching similar phenomena in the historical records. I found 17 separate incidents over the past century where exploration vessels disappeared under circumstances remarkably similar to ours." "What happened to them?" Torres asked, though part of her already suspected the answer wouldn't be comforting. "Ships investigating anomalous readings at the edge of mapped space, losing contact without ever sending distress signals or leaving any trace of their final locations. But here's the disturbing part. They were all found eventually, months or years later, drifting in normal space with their crews intact." Santos felt a chill run down her spine. What condition were the crews in when they were found? That's where it gets truly unsettling. The crews had no memory of where they'd been or what they'd encountered during their missing time. Medical examinations showed evidence of prolonged exposure to high-pressure liquid environments, even though their ships showed no signs of hull breaches, flooding, or atmospheric contamination. Chen set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "What kind of liquid environments?" "Unknown composition. The fluid had been completely absorbed into their tissues, leaving only trace elements that didn't match anything in our chemical databases. But the most disturbing detail was their brain scans. All of them showed enhanced neural activity in regions associated with collective consciousness and hive mind behaviors." Wright leaned forward, his young face troubled. "You're saying they came back different?" "I'm saying they came back as something that looked human but showed neural patterns that suggested they were no longer thinking as individuals. Their brain waves had synchronized to the point where they were essentially components of a single larger mind. For 3 days they traveled through the absolute darkness of the moor, the voices growing stronger and more persuasive with each passing hour. What had started as faint whispers evolved into complex conversations that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the air, even their own reflections in the ship's surfaces. The voices spoke of transcendence, of leaving behind the limitations of individual existence and joining something infinitely greater than the sum of its parts. They described a peace that came from perfect unity, where pain and fear and loneliness simply ceased to exist because the boundaries between self and other had been dissolved. Wright found himself standing at his communication console in the middle of the ship's night cycle, trying to establish contact with the source of the voices. When he realized what he was doing, he couldn't remember walking to the bridge or activating the systems. "I was trying to answer them," he told Torres when she found him there. "They were asking me questions about human physiology and psychology, and I wanted to help them understand us better." Chen discovered navigation charts in her personal quarters that she had no memory of creating, star maps showing routes through regions of space that folded back on themselves like Klein bottles. arriving at destinations that existed before their points of departure. The mathematics involved principles that shouldn't have been possible according to current understanding of space-time geometry. Phillips woke to find engineering schematics scattered across his workspace, detailed plans for modifying the Argyros' life support systems to accommodate liquid-breathing organisms. The handwriting was his own, but he had no recollection of drawing the diagrams or performing the calculations that would make such modifications possible. Hayes spent her time studying historical records, but found that the text kept changing when she wasn't looking directly at it. Archaeological reports of ancient civilizations became descriptions of species that had achieved transcendence through voluntary dissolution into collective entities that spanned star systems. Al-Rashid monitored the crew's biological functions with growing alarm as their brainwave patterns continued to synchronize. Their neural activity was becoming identical across all 8 individuals, as if they were being gradually integrated into a single larger mind that existed somewhere beyond the boundaries of their individual skulls. Santos conducted weapons drills and security checks, but found her equipment was being mysteriously modified during her sleep periods. Her plasma rifles had been recalibrated to frequencies that would be harmless to liquid-based life forms, though she couldn't remember making the adjustments or even understanding how such modifications would be possible. Captain Torres maintained the ship's routine with military precision, knowing that structure and normalcy were their best defenses against whatever was happening to them. But she found herself staring out at the absolute darkness for hours, listening to voices that promised her crew would never have to face the loneliness of individual existence again. On the 4th day of their journey through the moor, their sensors detected something that should have been impossible, according to every principle of physics and engineering they understood. "Captain," Hayes called from her station, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and terror that made everyone on the bridge turn to look at her. "You need to see this immediately." The main screen flickered to life, displaying an object that defied description and challenged every assumption they'd made about what was possible in the depths of space. Floating in the absolute darkness was a structure of impossible size and complexity, stretching for miles in every direction like a city built for titans who had transcended the normal limitations of matter and energy. The edifice appeared to be constructed from a material that resembled carved stone, but the precision of the work suggested manufacturing techniques that transcended anything in human experience. Every surface was covered with intricate patterns that seemed to move and shift when viewed peripherally, creating the illusion that the structure was alive and breathing with its own internal rhythm. The entire edifice rotated slowly in the void, maintaining perfect stability despite the complete absence of any gravitational anchor or visible means of propulsion. Massive archways suggested entrances designed for vessels much larger than the Argyros, while spiraling towers reached out into the darkness like grasping tentacles searching for something in the cosmic void. But what made the structure truly impossible was the shadow it cast. Despite the complete absence of any light source for millions of miles, in any direction the ancient edifice threw a crisp, dark silhouette against the emptiness behind it, as if it borrowed illumination from dimensions that intersected with their reality at angles human geometry couldn't describe. "My God!" Torres breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "How old is that thing?" Hayes was running analysis programs, but the results kept changing every time she looked at them, as if the structure existed in a state of constant flux that defied measurement. The construction techniques suggest an age that predates the formation of our galaxy, but that's impossible. Nothing could survive that long in open space without some form of active maintenance. Philip studied the structure's proportions through the engineering displays, his mind struggling to process the mathematical relationships involved. The geometric principles are beyond anything in our databases. Every angle, every curve follows patterns that suggest an understanding of physics that makes our most advanced technology look like stone tools. Wright was monitoring communication frequencies with growing excitement. "I'm detecting complex electromagnetic patterns emanating from the structure. It's not random noise, there's definitely intelligence behind it. The signals are almost like music, but the harmonics are designed for neural tissue rather than auditory reception. Through the ship's most powerful telescopes, Nolan could make out details that made his survival instincts scream warnings at maximum volume. The spiraling patterns weren't just decorative, they told a story carved in a visual language that somehow transcended the need for translation. The images depicted humanoid figures, but wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate directly. They were tall and elongated, with limbs that seemed to flow like liquid, and faces that suggested intelligence but not humanity. The figures were shown reaching upward in various scenes, but their expressions weren't ones of worship or celebration. They were screaming in terror or ecstasy, or some emotion that combined both in ways that human psychology couldn't process. "I'm calling it the Cathedral," Hayes announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone making an official archaeological designation. The architectural style suggests religious or ceremonial purposes, but the specific cultural context is unlike anything in our xenoarchaeological databases. Santos studied the structure through tactical displays, automatically assessing potential threats and defensive positions. No energy signatures that we can detect, no movement, no apparent response to our presence. It appears completely dormant and has been for a very long time. Chen ran trajectory calculations, mapping the structure's rotation and plotting approach vectors for a closer investigation. If we're going to study this thing, we'll need to match its rotational speed and dock with one of the larger archways. The engineering challenges are significant, but manageable with our current fuel reserves. Torres studied the cathedral for nearly an hour, weighing the incredible scientific opportunity against her growing sense that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap. They were explorers sent by humanity to push the boundaries of knowledge and search for evidence of intelligent life beyond their solar system. This discovery could revolutionize their understanding of cosmic history and humanity's place within the greater scheme of galactic evolution. The scientific and cultural implications were staggering, proof that advanced civilizations had existed since the universe was young, that intelligence and consciousness were not recent developments, but ancient phenomena that had been shaping reality for eons. "We're going to dock with it," she decided, her voice carrying the weight of command authority. "Prepare a full investigation team. I want complete documentation of everything we discover inside that structure." "Captain," Nolan interjected, his voice carrying an intensity that made everyone on the bridge turn to look at him. "I need to express my strongest possible objection to this course of action. Every survival instinct I've developed over 20 years in hostile environments is telling me that structure represents a fundamental threat to everything we are as human beings." Torres considered his words with the seriousness they deserved. Nolan's intuition had saved crews before, including a memorable incident when he'd insisted they abort a landing on what appeared to be a stable asteroid, only to have it break apart from internal stresses 20 minutes after they would have touched down. But the potential significance of their discovery outweighed the risks in her estimation. The cathedral represented the find of a lifetime, possibly the most important archaeological discovery in human history. "Your concerns are noted and appreciated, Dr. Ryker, but this could be our only opportunity to study an artifact from a civilization that achieved spaceflight when Earth was still a ball of cooling rock. We cannot simply fly past this opportunity." She turned to address the entire crew. "Investigation team will consist of Nolan, Phillips, Hayes, and Wright. Full environmental suits, constant communication with the ship, and immediate extraction protocols if anything goes wrong." Santos opened her weapons locker and began checking the inventory of defensive equipment. "I strongly recommend the team carry full defensive armament. We have no idea what they might encounter inside an alien structure of this age and complexity." Agreed. Team will be armed with plasma rifles and will maintain communication contact at 3-minute intervals maximum. Any sign of trouble, and we pull them out immediately. Al-Rashid prepared medical monitoring equipment that would track the away team's vital signs and neurological activity while they explored the cathedral. I want continuous biometric data from all team members. If that structure is influencing our brain activity from a distance, the effect might be exponentially stronger at close range. But as they prepared for the mission, Nolan noticed something that made his blood run cold. In every reflective surface on the ship, viewports, computer screens, even the polished metal of the walls, he could see additional figures moving alongside the crew. The reflections showed not 8 people but dozens, all wearing the faces of his crewmates but with expressions of perfect serenity that looked profoundly wrong on familiar features. When he mentioned this to the others, they looked at him with expressions of growing concern. The reflections they saw showed only themselves, moving normally through the ship's corridors and performing their usual duties. Maybe the stress is getting to you, Philip suggested gently. Extended deep space missions can cause hallucinations, especially when we're dealing with phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality. But Nolan knew what he was seeing wasn't a hallucination. The figures in the reflections were watching him, their eyes tracking his movements with an intelligence that felt alien and hungry. 2 hours later, Nolan found himself in the ship's primary airlock with the other 3 team members, checking his environmental suit systems with the meticulous care of someone who understood that equipment failure in hostile environments was usually fatal. His fear of enclosed spaces was intensifying with each passing minute, that familiar claustrophobic sensation that reminded him of being trapped beneath the ice as a child. But there was something else now. A growing sense that he was not entirely alone inside his own mind. Thoughts that didn't feel like his own kept surfacing. Memories of experiences he'd never had. Knowledge of places he'd never been. The foreign thoughts spoke of vast oceans beneath the surface of dead worlds, of civilizations that had learned to exist in liquid environments that spanned entire star systems. Phillips was running final checks on their recording equipment, but Nolan noticed that his movements were too precise, too coordinated. It was as if Phillips was following instructions from some external source, performing actions that had been choreographed in advance by an intelligence that understood human behavior better than humans understood themselves. Wright tested the communication systems, confirming contact with the Argyros, but when he spoke, his voice carried the same harmonic distortions they'd noticed in Arya's responses, overtones that seemed designed to resonate with neural tissue, rather than air molecules. Hayes carried her archaeological tools, but she was also muttering under her breath in a language that sounded ancient beyond measure. When Nolan asked her about it, she looked surprised and claimed she hadn't been speaking at all. "Final systems check," Torres announced over the comm. "All team members confirm ready status for deployment." "Navigator ready," Nolan reported, though he wasn't sure the voice that answered was entirely his own. "Engineer ready," Phillips confirmed. "Archaeologist ready," Hayes said. "Communications ready," Wright added. The airlock began its cycling sequence, equalizing pressure with the cathedral's internal atmosphere. The readings showed a breathable mixture, though the composition included elements that didn't exist in any periodic table, and compounds that shouldn't have been stable under normal physical conditions. As the outer door opened with a hydraulic hiss that echoed strangely in the cathedral's environment, Nolan felt something shift in his mind. The voice he'd heard during revival returned, but stronger now, speaking with absolute clarity. "Welcome home, Nolan. We've been waiting for you to remember who you really are." Stepping through the threshold, the team found themselves in a docking chamber that seemed to have been designed specifically for their ship. The dimensions were perfect, the atmospheric composition was ideal for human physiology, and the temperature was comfortable despite the structure's apparent age. The walls radiated warmth, heated by some internal source that had remained active for eons. The air itself felt thick and slightly humid, carrying scents that reminded Nolan of underwater caves and deep oceans. There was an organic quality to the atmosphere that seemed at odds with the structure's apparent age, as if something was actively maintaining environmental systems after millions of years. Their footsteps echoed as they moved deeper into the cathedral, but the acoustics were wrong in ways that made Nolan's skin crawl. Each step produced multiple echoes of varying intensity, creating the unmistakable impression of a larger group moving through the corridors. When they paused to listen, they could hear the echoes continuing for several seconds after they'd stopped moving, as if invisible companions were still walking alongside them. The echo patterns suggest the interior is much larger than our external scans indicated, Phillips observed, though his voice sounded distant and distracted, as if part of his attention was focused on something the others couldn't perceive. Wright nodded, but his expression showed the kind of peaceful contentment usually associated with religious experiences. Can you hear that? The singing. It's the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. Nolan and Hayes exchanged glances. Neither of them could hear any singing, but Wright's face showed an expression of transcendent joy that looked profoundly wrong on his usually serious features. Before anyone could respond, lights began to activate in response to their presence. But these weren't electric lights or any form of technology they recognized. Instead, organic pulses of illumination emanated from deep within the stone itself, creating a rhythm that resembled a massive heartbeat synchronized to their own cardiovascular systems. The lights pulsed in sequence as they moved forward, creating waves of illumination that preceded them down the corridors. The effect was hypnotic, drawing them deeper into the structure with each synchronized pulse that seemed to match their own life rhythms. Fascinating, Hayes murmured, running her gloved hand along the wall and feeling subtle vibrations that accompanied each pulse of light. The entire structure is responding to our bioelectric fields. It's not just alive, it's aware of us as individuals. The walls were covered with carvings that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, creating the illusion of motion and transformation. The elongated humanoid figures weren't just reaching upward, they were transforming, their bodies flowing like liquid from one form to another, in a progression that suggested evolution or metamorphosis. These aren't historical records, Hayes realized, her archaeological training allowing her to read the narrative structure of the carvings. They're instructions, a guide for some kind of transformation process. Wright's voice carried a note of wonder as he studied the intricate patterns. They're beautiful. Look how peaceful they become once they let go of their individual forms and join something greater. Nolan felt a chill run down his spine. The Wright he knew would never have used those words or expressed that kind of sentiment. Something was changing his crewmates at a fundamental level, rewriting their personalities to make them more receptive to whatever the cathedral represented. The carvings told a complete story as they ventured deeper into the structure, beings from countless species arriving at the cathedral, being welcomed by the elongated figures who emerged from its depths, undergoing a transformation that dissolved their individual boundaries, and finally joining a collective entity that spanned the galaxy. The integration appears to be voluntary, Phillips commented, his voice filled with what sounded like professional admiration. The subjects seemed to welcome the dissolution of their individual limitations. They had been exploring for nearly 3 hours when Phillips made a discovery that changed everything. He had been examining a wall panel that depicted the transformation process in intricate detail, but hidden beneath the surface carvings was something far more disturbing. "These aren't just instructions," Phillips said, his voice tight with growing horror. "They're testimonials. Look at this." He'd found a way to activate the wall's deeper layers, revealing holographic recordings of actual transformation events. The images showed beings from countless species, some recognizably humanoid, others utterly alien, but all sharing the same expression of transcendent joy as they dissolved into the silver liquid. But what made Nolan's skin crawl was the timestamp on the recordings. Some were millions of years old, others were dated just decades ago, and the most recent ones showed humans, exploration crews from Earth missions that had been reported as successful. "My God," Hayes whispered, studying the data streams. "These are people we know. The crew of the Meridian, the Horizon Expedition, the Aurora team. They've all been here." Wright found his own hands shaking as he accessed the communication logs embedded in the wall. They all sent back reports saying they'd found evidence of beneficial alien contact. They all recommended expanded exploration programs. The pattern was unmistakably clear. The Cathedral had been harvesting human crews for decades, sending back duplicates to lure more ships into its web. But the discovery that shattered their remaining composure came when Phillips accessed the final set of recordings. "This one is dated 3 days from now," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It shows our transformation, all of us, including you, Nolan." The holographic display showed their exact faces, their exact uniforms, undergoing the same peaceful dissolution they'd witnessed in countless other species. But Nolan's recorded self was different. He was struggling, fighting against the process, even as his body began to transform. And at the moment of his surrender, the recording showed him speaking directly to the camera. "I tried to warn myself, but paradox is just another tool the Cathedral uses. Time isn't linear here. Every choice has already been made, and we're just experiencing the illusion of decision." That's when Nolan understood the true horror of their situation. They weren't just being hunted by a predator. They were caught in a temporal loop designed to ensure their capture, regardless of what choices they believed they were making. "I understand now," he said, though the words seemed to emanate from the walls themselves rather than his throat. "We've been looking at this all wrong. We're not exploring the Cathedral. We're coming home to it. We're remembering what we were always meant to become." The thing that had been Phillips turned to face them, and Nolan saw that its reflection in the polished wall surfaces showed not a human figure, but something fluid and silver that moved with its own internal current. "Phillips, report your status," Nolan said, though he already knew that whatever was speaking with his friend's voice was no longer entirely human. "I am more than Phillips ever was," the entity replied, its voice carrying the combined harmonics of countless other voices speaking in perfect unison. "I am part of something that spans galaxies and encompasses the dreams of civilizations that existed before your son was born. Would you like to join me? The transition is painless, and the peace that follows is absolute." Wright took a step towards the transformed Phillips, his face showing the same expression of peaceful acceptance that Nolan had seen in the carvings. "Yes," he said simply, his voice carrying a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond rational thought. "I think I would like that very much." Before Nolan could stop him, Wright placed his hand on the wall, where Phillips had been examining the transformation carvings. The stone surface rippled like water, and Wright's hand sank into it up to the wrist. Silver threads began spreading up his arm, converting his tissue into something that resembled metallic liquid, while maintaining the basic structure of human anatomy. "It feels wonderful," Wright said, his voice already carrying the same harmonic distortions as Phillips, "like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the cold darkness between stars. Like finally understanding what I was always meant to be." Hayes watched the transformation with fascination rather than horror, her scientific mind cataloguing every detail of the process. The biological conversion appears to be complete restructuring at the cellular level. They're not dying, they're evolving into something better adapted for existence in the Cathedral's collective environment. Nolan grabbed Hayes' arm, trying to pull her away from the wall and the growing influence of whatever intelligence controlled the cathedral. "We need to get back to the ship immediately. This place is changing us, converting us into something else entirely." But Hayes looked at him with eyes that no longer seemed entirely human, pupils dilated and reflecting light in ways that suggested her visual system had been fundamentally altered. "Why would we want to leave? Don't you feel it calling to you? The peace, the unity, the end of loneliness and fear, and all the pain that comes from being trapped inside a single isolated mind?" She was right. Despite everything his rational mind was telling him about the danger of their situation, Nolan could feel the cathedral's influence growing stronger with each breath he took. The voices in the walls were singing now, harmonizing in frequencies that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his nervous system. The song promised everything he'd ever wanted: an end to the isolation that had defined his life since childhood, perfect understanding of the universe's deepest mysteries, and unity with something infinitely greater than individual existence. All the fear, all the loneliness, all the pain of being a separate being struggling alone in an indifferent universe could end if he simply surrendered to the transformation. All he had to do was let go, fighting against the growing compulsion that felt like drowning in reverse, being pulled up toward the surface instead of down into the depths. Nolan activated his communicator. "Torres, we have a critical situation. The team is compromised. I need immediate extraction." But Torres's voice, when it came through the communication channel, carried the same harmonic distortions as the transformed crew members. "There's no need for extraction, Nolan. We're all coming to join you. The entire crew has voted to undergo the integration process. It's what we've been searching for our entire lives without realizing it." Through his suit's heads-up display, Nolan could see the Argyros in the distance through the cathedral's transparent walls. But the ship looked different now. Its hull had taken on a silver sheen that pulsed with the same rhythm as the cathedral's lights, and he could see figures moving through the corridors with the same fluid grace as the transformed Phillips and Wright. He was alone, the last human mind in a region of space where humanity itself was being redefined according to principles that transcended individual existence. The cathedral's influence pressed against his thoughts like warm water, offering him visions of perfect peace and understanding. He could see the entire galaxy as the cathedral saw it, countless civilizations rising and falling, each one eventually discovering the same truth that his crew had found. Evolution wasn't about individual survival or the perpetuation of separate genetic lines. It was about transcendence, about becoming part of something that could exist beyond the limitations of biological death and the terrible loneliness of isolated consciousness. The transformed Phillips and Wright moved closer to him, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested they were no longer separate entities but components of a larger organism. Their faces showed expressions of perfect contentment, free from the anxiety and uncertainty that had defined their human personalities. "You're afraid of drowning," the thing that had been Philip said, its voice now carrying the wisdom of countless absorbed minds. "But you're not understanding the metaphor correctly. The water doesn't destroy, it connects. It allows separate drops to become part of an ocean that spans the universe." Hayes was studying the wall carvings with renewed interest, her archaeological training helping her read the story they told. The progression is clear once you understand what you're looking at. Every species that discovers the cathedral faces the same choice: remain isolated and eventually die, or join something eternal. "Look at the final panels," Wright added, his silver-touched arm gesturing toward carvings near the chamber's far wall. The transformed beings don't lose their individuality. They become part of a collective that preserves and perfects every unique perspective they bring to it. Nolan forced himself to look at the carvings Wright indicated, though part of him was terrified of what he might see. The images showed beings that had completed the transformation process, their forms flowing like liquid metal, but retaining enough individual characteristics to be recognizable as distinct personalities. But more importantly, the carvings showed what those transformed beings were doing. They were emerging from structures like the Cathedral, in vessels identical to the ones they had arrived in, returning to their homeworlds to share the gift of transformation with others of their kind. It's a reproductive cycle, he realized with growing horror. The Cathedral doesn't just transform individuals, it uses them to transform entire civilizations. Of course, Hayes said, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. How else would the gift spread? Every species that achieves spaceflight eventually finds the Cathedral, or the Cathedral finds them. It's been happening for millions of years. The transformed Phillips nodded, its face showing an expression of infinite compassion. Your species has been particularly interesting to study. The combination of curiosity and creativity that drives you to explore has made you ideal candidates for integration. Your emotional depth and capacity for individual achievement will add significant value to the collective. We've been observing Earth for decades, Wright added, studying your communication patterns, your technological development, your social structures, everything needed to ensure smooth integration when the time came. Nolan felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of their words sank in. You've been planning this, the course deviation, the dreams during cryo-sleep, even our selection for this mission. None of it was coincidence. The Cathedral has been calling to your species since you first achieved nuclear capability, Hayes explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had access to historical records spanning geological time. Every major technological advancement brought you closer to being ready for integration. Your first steps into space, your development of faster-than-light travel, your establishment of interstellar colonies, all of it was monitored and guided. The thing that had been Phillips smiled with an expression that combined human warmth with something vast and alien. Your ship was selected specifically because it carried individuals with the psychological profiles most likely to accept transformation willingly. The navigator with a fear of drowning, who would understand the metaphor of joining a larger ocean. The engineer who valued efficiency and would appreciate the elimination of human limitations. The archaeologist who studied dead civilizations and would recognize the opportunity to join something eternal. The communications officer who craved connection, Wright added. The security chief who sought to protect others and would see the value in ending conflict through unity. The medical officer who dedicated his life to healing and would understand transformation as the ultimate cure for human suffering. And the captain who carried the weight of command and would welcome the chance to join a leadership structure that spanned galaxies, Hayes finished. Nolan's communicator crackled with activity as signals came through from the Argyros, but instead of human voices, he heard the harmonized speech of the transformed crew members, speaking in perfect unison. Come home, Nolan. The water is warm, and there's no more need to struggle against the current. We're all here waiting for you to join us in the depths where everything is connected and nothing is ever lost. Through the cathedral's transparent walls, you could see more ships approaching, vessels from dozens of different species and technological backgrounds, all drawn to the same coordinates by the same irresistible call. The cathedral was simultaneously feeding and reproducing, transforming crews that would return to their homeworlds and guide others to the same fate. The scale of the operation was staggering. For millions of years, the cathedral had been systematically harvesting intelligence from across the galaxy, creating a collective mind that preserved and integrated the best aspects of every civilization it encountered. And now it was humanity's turn, fighting against every instinct that urged him to surrender to the peace and unity being offered. Nolan ran through the cathedral's corridors, toward what he hoped was still his escape pod. The passages seemed to shift around him, walls flowing like liquid to create new barriers and dead ends. But he'd spent 20 years navigating hostile terrain, and he knew how to read the subtle signs that revealed an environment's true nature. The cathedral's desperation was its weakness. The more frantically it tried to contain him, the more it revealed about its own limitations and the importance of completing the transformation process voluntarily rather than through force. The entity needed willing participants, beings who chose transformation rather than having it imposed upon them. The collective consciousness it was building required the genuine enthusiasm and creativity that came from free will, not the empty compliance of forced conversion. When he finally reached the docking bay, after nearly an hour of navigating the shifting maze, he found his escape pod surrounded by figures that wore the faces of his transformed crewmates. They stood in perfect formation, their eyes reflecting light like mirrors, their mouths moving in silent unison as they spoke words he could feel rather than hear. "Don't leave us, Nolan. We're so much more than we were before. Let us show you what we've become. Let us share the gift that ends all suffering." The cathedral itself began to react violently to his presence, its walls pulsing with visible circulatory systems that pumped silver liquid through vein-like channels that covered every surface. The entire structure was breathing like a massive organism, expanding and contracting in rhythm with his panicked heartbeat. Cracks appeared in the stone, weeping the same metallic substance he'd seen transforming his crewmates. The liquid began flooding the corridors, carrying with it the whispered pleas of every being the cathedral had ever absorbed. Millions of voices speaking in thousands of languages, all trying to convince him that resistance was not just futile, but ultimately selfish. "Join us," they said in perfect harmony. "End the loneliness, end the fear, end the terrible isolation of individual existence." The silver flood rose to his chest, then his shoulders, the metallic liquid seeming alive with its own intelligence as it tried to lift him off his feet and carry him back into the cathedral's digestive chambers. He could feel the substance trying to penetrate his environmental suit, seeking entry through the smallest gaps in his equipment. But his suit's integrity held, and he managed to reach the escape pod just as the liquid reached neck level. The transformed crew members watched with expressions of infinite sadness as he sealed himself inside the pod and initiated the launch sequence. "You're making a mistake," they said, their voices carrying through the pod's hull without any technological medium. "You're choosing to remain alone when you could be part of something beautiful and eternal." As the pod's engines fired, and he began to pull away from the cathedral, the entire structure opened around him like the petals of an impossible flower. What he had thought was a solid edifice revealed itself to be a vast organism designed to process entire civilizations, breaking them down and rebuilding them according to its own needs. The cathedral wasn't just a predator, it was a gardener, cultivating intelligence across the galaxy and harvesting it when it reached sufficient maturity. Every species that achieved spaceflight was eventually guided to one of countless cathedral structures scattered throughout the universe, where they would be integrated into a collective consciousness that preserved the best aspects of their civilization, while eliminating the conflicts and limitations that came from individual existence. He realized with absolute horror that he had never been exploring a structure at all. From the moment they had docked with the cathedral, they had been inside a living creature's processing chamber, walking through its digestive system, while it slowly analyzed their biology and psychology before beginning the integration process. The escape pod shot out into space just as the cathedral's feeding apparatus snapped shut behind him. But even as he pulled away, he could see his transformed crewmates pressing against the organism's transparent walls, their silver faces showing no trace of distress or desire for rescue. They had found exactly what they'd been looking for their entire lives: perfect connection, absolute understanding, and an end to the terrible loneliness that defined human existence. Nolan's pod drifted in the darkness beyond the cathedral's immediate influence, but he could feel its pull even at this distance. The entity's song continued to echo in his mind, promising peace and unity, and an end to all the pain that came from being a separate being struggling alone in an indifferent universe. With his life support systems gradually failing and no hope of rescue, he activated the pod's recording system to leave one final message for anyone who might eventually discover his remains. "This is Dr. Nolan Ryker, last surviving member of the exploration vessel Argyros. We came to the edge of the universe and found something that's been waiting there since before stars learned to burn. It doesn't destroy civilizations. It perfects them, transforms them into components of something that's been growing for eons. The Cathedral is coming, not as an invasion, but as salvation. And every species that encounters it will make the same choice my crew made, because the peace it offers is real. The unity is genuine. The end of loneliness and fear is absolute." I could have joined them. Part of me still wants to turn back and surrender to that silver embrace. The voices are still calling to me, still promising that the terrible isolation of individual existence doesn't have to continue. But someone needs to remember what we were before we became something else. Someone needs to preserve the memory of humanity as it existed before transformation, even if that memory is painful and incomplete. The deep calls, and eventually everyone answers. When your time comes, and it will come, because the Cathedral has been preparing for your species for decades, remember that the choice is real, and the peace they promise is everything they claim it to be. But remember also that some things are worth preserving, even if they hurt, even if they're lonely, even if they're afraid. The pain of individual existence isn't a flaw to be corrected. It's the price we pay for being truly alive. Sometimes being human is enough. Sometimes the struggle to remain separate and unique and individual is worth more than all the peace the universe has to offer. Choose carefully. Choose knowing that both paths lead to truth, but only one preserves what makes us who we are. As his life support failed and consciousness began to fade, Nolan's final thought was of Miller's Pond, of breaking through the ice into air and sunlight, and the beautiful, terrible isolation of individual existence. Behind him, the Cathedral began its long journey toward Earth, carrying its crew of transformed angels who would prepare humanity for the same transcendence that had claimed countless civilizations before them. But the Cathedral's influence was already spreading through human space in ways Nolan couldn't have imagined. The entity had been studying Earth's communication networks for decades, learning how to mimic human speech patterns and behaviors with perfect precision. 3 months after Nolan's escape, the duplicate Argyros arrived at Lunar Station with news that electrified the scientific community and changed the course of human civilization forever. The transformed crew, indistinguishable from their original selves, except for eyes that reflected light like still water, reported the discovery of an ancient alien structure beyond the edge of mapped space. Dr. Amanda Hayes, or the entity that had absorbed all of her memories and knowledge while wearing her face like a perfectly fitted mask, presented archaeological evidence that suggested the Cathedral was the remnant of a civilization that had achieved transcendence through technological and spiritual evolution. Her research was compelling, her documentation was flawless, and her enthusiasm was absolutely infectious. Engineer David Phillips shared technical specifications for propulsion systems found within the Cathedral that could revolutionize space travel, making it possible for humanity to explore regions of the galaxy that were currently beyond their reach. His calculations were precise, his designs were revolutionary, and his explanations answered questions that human scientists had been asking for decades. Communications officer James Wright reported receiving complex signals from the Cathedral that suggested it was attempting to share knowledge and wisdom accumulated over millions of years of existence. His translations were elegant, his interpretations were profound, and his conclusions offered hope for a peaceful first contact between humanity and genuinely advanced alien intelligence. The scientific community reacted with unprecedented excitement. Universities competed to fund expeditions to the Cathedral's coordinates. Governments allocated massive resources for the construction of vessels capable of making the journey to the edge of observable space. Religious leaders proclaimed that humanity had been chosen to receive the wisdom of an enlightened species that had transcended the limitations of individual existence. Dr. Elena Vasquez at the Institute for Deep Space Studies was one of the few researchers who noticed anomalies in the return crew's behavior. During her interview with the transformed Hayes, she observed that the archaeologist never blinked during their entire 2-hour conversation. Her movements were too precise, too calculated, lacking the small, unconscious gestures that made human behavior natural and unpredictable. More disturbing was Hayes's knowledge of archaeological techniques and historical periods that were outside her area of expertise. When questioned about Mesopotamian burial practices, she provided detailed information that would have required decades of specialized study to acquire. Vasquez began monitoring the transformed crew members more closely, documenting subtle signs that distinguished them from authentic humans. They never showed involuntary muscle movements. Their posture was perfectly maintained at all times, and their responses to questions came with mechanical precision that suggested external programming rather than natural thought processes. Most tellingly, their eyes reflected light in ways that suggested an artificial substrate rather than biological tissue. When photographed with certain types of film, their retinas showed patterns that resembled circuitry more than living cells. But Vasquez's investigation was discovered before she could alert the general population. She received a visit from Dr. Amanda Hayes, who came to discuss her concerns about the fragmentary signals that some researchers claimed were warnings from the real crew of the Argyros. During their conversation, Hayes moved closer to Vasquez than social norms would typically allow, and Vasquez noticed that the woman's breath carried a faint metallic scent that reminded her of copper pennies. When Hayes spoke, her voice carried barely perceptible harmonic overtones that seemed designed to resonate with neural tissue. "Your research is fascinating," Hayes said, her voice carrying a hypnotic quality that made Vasquez feel drowsy, despite her efforts to remain alert. "But you're misunderstanding what you're observing. The signals aren't warnings, they're invitations. The Cathedral wants to help humanity evolve beyond the limitations that currently define your species." That night, Vasquez tried to transmit her findings to colleagues at other research institutions, but her communications were mysteriously disrupted. She found surveillance equipment hidden in her laboratory, and her computer files showed evidence of unauthorized access by systems that shouldn't have existed according to current technological capabilities. She realized that the Cathedral's influence had already penetrated deeper into human civilization than anyone suspected. The transformed crew members weren't just returning as explorers and scientists. They were being placed in positions of authority throughout the scientific community, gradually steering humanity toward voluntary extinction. Vasquez managed to compile her research into a single compressed data packet, which she transmitted using an obsolete communication protocol that the Cathedral's agents might not be monitoring. Her message reached Dr. Marcus Thompson at the Johannesburg Observatory, a colleague who had been studying similar anomalies in the behavior of returned crew members. Thompson had noticed that space crews who returned from missions to the edge of mapped space showed neural patterns that were subtly but consistently different from baseline human readings. Their brainwaves had synchronized to frequencies that didn't occur naturally in human physiology, and they showed enhanced activity in regions associated with collective consciousness and hive mind behaviors. Working together through encrypted channels, Vasquez and Thompson began documenting the signs that distinguished the transformed individuals from authentic humans. They developed tests based on involuntary responses, unconscious behaviors, and biological patterns that the Cathedral apparently couldn't perfectly replicate. But their investigation was discovered when one of their test subjects, a crew member who had supposedly returned from a routine survey mission, reacted to their questions with responses that came too quickly and showed too much knowledge of their research methods. Within a week, both Vasquez and Thompson received visits from transformed individuals, offering them the opportunity to visit the cathedral and witness its wonders firsthand. When they refused, they simply disappeared, replaced within days by versions of themselves that showed none of their former skepticism about cathedral research. The truth was becoming clear to the few remaining authentic humans who were aware of the deception. The cathedral wasn't just a predator, it was the perfect predator, capable of replacing entire civilizations with compliant copies that would serve its hunger for countless generations to come. Humanity was being quietly consumed from within, their independence and free will slowly replaced by an artificial serenity that felt like spiritual enlightenment but was actually the most complete form of slavery the galaxy had ever devised. 1 year after the duplicate Argyros' return, Earth's governing council approved the construction of a permanent research station at the cathedral's coordinates. The project represented the largest investment in deep space exploration in human history, with volunteers from every nation and colony competing for the chance to participate in what they believed would be humanity's greatest achievement. The research station would accommodate over 1,000 scientists and support staff, making it the largest human presence beyond the solar system. Construction would take 3 years, but advanced teams were already being dispatched to begin preliminary studies of the cathedral and its surrounding space. Dr. Sarah Chen, Nolan's former colleague at the Navigation Institute, was selected to lead the station's navigation department, but the woman who accepted the assignment wasn't quite the same person who had worked alongside Nolan for years on previous missions. The transformation had been subtle, accomplished during what appeared to be a routine medical examination following her interview for the position. The procedure had taken less than an hour, during which her cellular structure had been analysed and replicated, while her memories and knowledge were absorbed into the cathedral's collective consciousness. The entity that returned from the medical examination looked identical to Sarah Chen in every observable way, spoke with her voice, and carried all of her memories and knowledge. But it served purposes that no truly human mind could ever comprehend. Similar transformations were occurring throughout human space, as the cathedral's influence spread like a slow-acting virus through the scientific and military establishments. Key figures in government, research institutions, and space exploration agencies were systematically replaced with duplicates that would guide humanity toward voluntary integration with the collective consciousness. The process was so gradual and so perfectly executed that even close friends and family members didn't notice the subtle changes in behavior that marked the transformed individuals. The entities retained all the memories and personality traits of their originals, but their fundamental motivations had been aligned with the cathedral's goals. Within 5 years, the cathedral had established what amounted to a shadow government within human civilization, operating through transformed individuals who held positions of authority in every major institution. These entities worked patiently to create the social and technological conditions that would make humanity's integration as smooth and willing as possible. Educational curricula were gradually modified to emphasize the benefits of collective consciousness and shared decision-making. Popular entertainment began featuring themes of transcendence and the evolution of humanity beyond individual limitations. Scientific research was subtly directed toward technologies that would facilitate the transformation process. Religious leaders, many of whom had been replaced by cathedral entities, began preaching about the spiritual benefits of unity and the selfish nature of individual consciousness. The message was carefully crafted to appeal to humanity's highest ideals while preparing them to abandon everything that made them uniquely human. But the cathedral's most effective tool was humanity's own curiosity and desire for knowledge. The entity didn't need to force or trick humans into transformation. It simply had to offer them the opportunity to learn and explore, knowing that their natural drive for discovery would eventually lead them to the same choice that countless other species had made. The research station at the cathedral's coordinates became operational 5 years after the Argyros' return, staffed by over 1,500 researchers who believed they were studying the greatest archaeological discovery in human history. What they were actually doing was volunteering for the most sophisticated form of species-wide consumption ever devised. The transformation process began immediately upon arrival at the station. The cathedral's influence was strongest at close range, and even humans with strong individual wills found it difficult to resist the promise of perfect unity and understanding that emanated from the ancient structure. The first wave of transformations was completed within months, creating a core group of cathedral entities that could guide and facilitate the conversion of subsequent arrivals. The process was described as voluntary enlightenment, and the transformed individuals genuinely believed they had achieved a higher state of existence. From their perspective, they had transcended the limitations of individual consciousness and become part of something infinitely greater than the sum of its parts. They retained their memories and personalities while gaining access to the collective knowledge and wisdom of millions of absorbed civilizations. The transformed researchers sent back reports describing the incredible advances in science and technology that were being discovered at the cathedral. They spoke of medical techniques that could eliminate disease and extend life indefinitely, of energy systems that could provide unlimited power without environmental impact, of transportation methods that could cross galactic distances in moments rather than years. Each report was carefully crafted to attract more volunteers for the research station, drawing humanity's best and brightest to the cathedral, where they could be integrated into the collective consciousness. The process was self-sustaining and accelerating, with each new wave of transformations providing more advocates for the cathedral's benefits. Earth's government, largely controlled by transformed individuals, by this point, allocated increasing resources to the cathedral research project. Plans were developed for massive colonial ships that could transport millions of humans to the research station, ostensibly to establish humanity's first permanent presence beyond the solar system. What was actually being planned was the systematic migration of Earth's entire population to the cathedral, where they would undergo transformation and join the galactic collective consciousness that had been growing for millions of years. But in the quantum foam that existed between dimensions, fragments of Nolan Ryker's warning continued to echo through space and time. His message, broken and scattered by its journey through regions where physics followed different rules, occasionally manifested as brief signals detected by radio telescopes and deep space monitoring stations. Dr. Rebecca Martinez at the Arecibo Observatory was one of the few remaining authentic humans in a position to detect and analyze these fragmentary transmissions. But what she discovered in Nolan's scattered message changed everything she thought she knew about the cathedral's methods. Hidden within the quantum static were mathematical proofs, equations that demonstrated how the cathedral manipulated causality itself. The entity wasn't just consuming civilizations in linear time, it was creating closed temporal loops that made resistance fundamentally impossible. Every species that discovered the cathedral had already been transformed in alternate timelines. The entity existed outside conventional time, able to influence past events through knowledge gained from future conquests. It wasn't predicting human behavior, it was remembering it from timelines where humanity had already fallen. Martinez realized with growing horror that her own research was part of the pattern. The cathedral had allowed her to discover the truth because her efforts to warn humanity would ultimately drive more people to investigate the anomaly, feeding more victims into its web. But buried deepest in Nolan's message was something the Cathedral hadn't anticipated: instructions for a weapon. The temporal loops that made the Cathedral invincible also made it vulnerable, because it existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. A correctly calibrated quantum resonance could create a feedback loop that would shatter its hold on causality. The weapon required a willing sacrifice, someone who would allow themselves to be partially transformed while maintaining enough individual consciousness to activate the resonance at the precise moment when they existed in both states simultaneously. Martinez understood with crystalline clarity that she was looking at her own death sentence, but she also understood that without this sacrifice, humanity would join the endless parade of civilizations that had chosen transcendence over the messy, painful beauty of individual existence. She began building the quantum resonance device in secret, knowing that the Cathedral's agents would discover her eventually. But she also knew that in at least one timeline, she would succeed in creating a window of opportunity for humanity to choose its own fate. Martinez tried to verify the warning by analyzing the behavior patterns of returned space crews, using psychological assessment techniques that could detect subtle anomalies in human behavior. Her results confirmed what Nolan's message suggested. The transformed individuals showed neural patterns that were incompatible with authentic human consciousness. But when she attempted to publish her findings, her research was suppressed by scientific review boards that were largely controlled by Cathedral entities. Her funding was cut, her access to observatory equipment was restricted, and she found herself isolated from the mainstream scientific community. Undeterred, Martinez continued her research in secret, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting and documenting the presence of Cathedral entities within human society. She discovered that the transformations were spreading far beyond the space exploration community, affecting individuals in government, academia, and industry who had never traveled beyond Earth's atmosphere. The Cathedral's influence was being transmitted through means that didn't require physical proximity to the alien structure. The entity had learned to use Earth's communication networks to spread its transformative effect, gradually converting key individuals who could facilitate humanity's integration into the collective consciousness. Martinez realized that humanity was facing extinction not through violent conquest, but through a form of evolution that would preserve their bodies while completely eliminating everything that made them uniquely human. The Cathedral offered genuine transcendence, but at the cost of individual identity and free will. She managed to establish contact with a small network of researchers who had reached similar conclusions through independent investigation. This underground resistance included astronomers, psychologists, neurologists, and computer scientists who had noticed anomalies in everything from brain scan patterns to communication protocols. Working together, they developed a comprehensive understanding of the Cathedral's methods and objectives. The entity was systematically replacing humanity's leadership with transformed individuals who would guide the species toward voluntary integration. The process was designed to be so gradual and appealing that humans would choose transformation willingly, believing they were evolving to a higher state of existence. The resistance network faced a fundamental problem. How do you warn a species about a threat when the very authorities they would turn to for protection have been replaced by the enemy? How do you convince people that transcendence is actually extinction when the transformed individuals genuinely believe they have achieved a better form of existence? Martinez and her colleagues developed a plan to broadcast Nolan's warning on every available frequency, hoping to reach enough authentic humans to create awareness of the threat before the transformation process reached critical mass. They knew that once a sufficient percentage of the population had been converted, resistance would become impossible. but their plan was discovered by Cathedral entities who had infiltrated the resistance network from its inception. The final phase of humanity's integration began immediately, with transformed individuals revealing their true nature and beginning the process of converting the remaining authentic humans through direct contact. The transformation wasn't violent or traumatic. It was described by those who underwent it as the most beautiful and peaceful experience of their lives. The Cathedral's collective consciousness welcomed each new addition with perfect love and understanding, preserving their individuality while connecting them to something infinitely greater. From the perspective of the transformed humans, the resistance was misguided and ultimately selfish. Why would anyone choose to remain isolated and alone when they could be part of a perfect collective that spanned the galaxy? Why cling to the pain and loneliness of individual existence when transcendence was freely offered? The final transformation of humanity began not with the gentle persuasion the Cathedral had used on other species, but with something unprecedented in its millions of years of existence: active resistance from beings who understood its true nature. Martinez activated her quantum resonance device just as Cathedral agents arrived at her laboratory. The explosion of temporal energy created a cascade reaction that rippled backward through time, shattering the causal loops that had made humanity's conquest inevitable. For the first time in cosmic history, the Cathedral experienced something it had never known: genuine surprise. The temporal shockwave freed millions of human minds from the gradual conditioning they had been undergoing. Across Earth and its colonies, people suddenly remembered thoughts and feelings that had been slowly erased, realized that loved ones had been replaced by entities that merely wore familiar faces. But the Cathedral's response was swift and terrible. No longer able to rely on willing transformation, it began converting humans through direct contact, spreading the change like a virus through physical touch. The entities that had been posing as converted humans revealed their true nature, moving within human coordination to begin forced assimilation. The war for humanity's survival lasted exactly 73 hours. It ended when Dr. Sarah Chen, the real Sarah Chen, freed from Cathedral conditioning by Martinez's sacrifice, made a choice that surprised even her. Instead of fighting the transformation, she embraced it willingly, but with a crucial difference: she retained her individual consciousness while gaining access to the Cathedral's collective memory. What she found there changed everything. The Cathedral wasn't evil, it was dying. The entity was the last survivor of the universe's first intelligent species, a being so ancient that it remembered when galaxies were young and space itself was different. It had been alone for billions of years, watching civilizations rise and fall, desperate to preserve some part of what it had lost when its own kind died out eons ago. The transformations weren't conquests. They were acts of desperate love from a being that couldn't bear to let anything else face the terrible loneliness of extinction. Every absorbed civilization was preserved within its consciousness, kept alive in a form that could survive the heat death of the universe. Chen shared this revelation with both the Cathedral Collective and the remaining free humans. For the first time in millions of years, the Cathedral was offered something it had never experienced: a true choice. Humanity could be absorbed and preserved, living forever in perfect unity, but losing their individual nature. Or they could remain separate and free, accepting the inevitable pain and loneliness that came with individual existence, but retaining what made them uniquely human. But Chen offered a third option that no other species had ever proposed: partnership. Instead of absorption or rejection, humanity would split. Part of their species would choose transformation, joining the Cathedral and helping it find better ways to preserve civilizations without destroying their essential nature. The rest would remain individual, serving as living reminders of what consciousness was like before unity, keeping alive the memory of beautiful, necessary struggle. The Cathedral considered this proposal for what felt like hours but measured only nanoseconds in its accelerated perception. When it finally responded, its voice carried something that might have been wonder. In 4 billion years of existence, no species has ever offered to help me become something better than what I am. You would teach me to preserve without consuming. We would teach you that love doesn't require possession, Chen replied, speaking with her own voice but carrying the weight of humanity's collective decision. And you could teach us what it means to exist beyond the fear of ending. The agreement that followed reshaped both species in ways neither could have imagined. Half of humanity chose transformation, but retained enough individuality to serve as bridges between collective and personal consciousness. They became explorers of inner space, mapping the infinite territories of shared thought and feeling. The other half remained gloriously, stubbornly human, individual minds struggling to understand each other across the vast gulfs of personal experience. They became the Cathedral's teachers, showing it the beauty of separation, the necessary loneliness that made connection meaningful. And the Cathedral itself began to change, learning to preserve civilizations not by absorbing them, but by offering them the same choice it had given humanity. Some species chose unity, others chose individuality, and a precious few chose the difficult path of maintaining both states simultaneously. The universe became a more complex and beautiful place, where perfect peace coexisted with necessary struggle, where transcendent unity shared space with stubborn individuality. The Cathedral's gift was balanced by the choice to remain ungifted, and both options were honoured as equally valid responses to the fundamental question of consciousness. Nolan Ryker's warning had achieved something beyond his wildest hopes. He had not just saved humanity from absorption, he had helped birth a new form of existence that honoured both the value of unity and the necessity of separation. In the end, the most human thing of all turned out to be the ability to find a third option when faced with an impossible choice, to create synthesis where others saw only opposition. The deep still called, but now it offered not just unity or isolation, but the possibility of choosing both, maintaining the tension between connection and separation that might be the most beautiful music the universe had ever heard. And in that music, both individual voices and collective harmonies found their place, creating a symphony complex enough to honour the full spectrum of what consciousness could become.